Did you know that the gaming community at large is boycotting Asus? In fact, we've seen a slew of million-view videos from massive YouTubers that are encouraging and even leading this rebellion. And the craziest part is that many of these YouTubers used to have extremely strong ties with Asus. Asus had given them tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of free parts and sponsored videos. Not to mention, Asus was a fan favorite. Over the past 2 decades, Asus has built up an extremely strong enthusiast gamer brand and community called ROG, or Republic of Gamers. And it wasn't uncommon to see completely Asus-themed setups just like these within the gaming community. Asus was even managing to break into the high-end laptop and mobile markets, something that even Google and Samsung were struggling with, largely thanks to the strength of the ROG brand and the gaming community at large. But despite all this brand loyalty and brand value, it only took a few wrong steps regarding abuse of customer trust, lack of accountability, and a little bit of arrogance to turn the entire community against Asus. So here's why gamers are fed up with Asus and are even going as far as boycotting the once cherished brand. If you're interested in having companies pay you, check out our bond investing app, Silo, in the description below. But anyway, one of the biggest complaints against Asus is that they've slowly veered away from what made them a cherished brand in the first place, which was high-quality hardware. High quality and reliability were historically synonymous with the Asus brand. Whether it's ROG motherboards, ROG GPUs, or ROG peripherals, these were always by far the most expensive options you could get. Their motherboards, for example, cost as much as $1,000. Their GPUs go for as much as $2,400, which is $800 more than what Nvidia charges, which is already a lot. Even their keyboards often cost more than $200. But while expensive, enthusiasts were more than happy to pony up this money to get the absolute best hardware. In fact, much of the gaming community views Asus as the elite brand, something that they aspire to own, similar to Apple's branding. But more recently, it seems that quality control has substantially declined for Asus, especially when it comes to their budget lineups. These issues have been especially evident with their motherboard and laptop lineups. We've seen more and more threads starting to surface regarding budget Asus motherboards and laptops straight up dying. And the worst part is that many of these instances happen just 1 to 2 weeks after the warranty period ends. So it almost feels like Asus is implementing some sort of planned obsolescence, similar to what many people accuse Apple of. It seems that with the budget lineups, Asus has resorted to building underwhelming products and slapping the ROG brand on them to move units. This strategy has proven to be quite effective in terms of sales, but has left many customers rather disappointed. Such issues have been going on for a few years now, but these concerns have largely been swept under the rug as a poor man's problem. When it came to Asus's higher-end hardware, it was still top of the line, so most of the community just didn't care, until issues started popping up on the flagship hardware as well. The issue that has thrown all of this drama into overdrive is an enthusiast hobby called overclocking. For most of us, the computers and the phones we have are usually overkill for browsing social media and just watching YouTube videos. But when it comes to gaming, there is no such thing as too much power. Enthusiasts love to push their machines to the absolute max, and one way they accomplish this is by overclocking their hardware, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you push your CPU, GPU, RAM, and other components past their factory settings. For example, an out-of-the-box CPU might clock in at 4.5 GHz. This means that each core of the CPU can complete 4.5 billion clock cycles per second. If that sounds crazy, it's because it is. Technology has come a long way, but let's say you wanted even more power. Well then, you can go into the BIOS of your motherboard and manually change the CPU clocking to 5 GHz. This would mean that each core of your CPU can now handle 5 billion clock cycles per second. To make this jump though, you'll have to increase the voltage that's fed to the CPU and have a strong cooling system, usually liquid cooling. If you push your CPU, or any component for that matter, too far, you run the risk of frying that component. This probably sounds like a risky hobby, and at one point it definitely was. But with the reliability and stability of modern chips and motherboards, overclocking is common practice. If your computer senses that it's being pushed too far, the worst that usually happens is that it shuts down. In fact, many enthusiast motherboards, like the ones from Asus, come with inbuilt automatic overclocking options. Gamers rarely take advantage of automatic overclocking and usually prefer manual overclocking, but it just goes to show you how common practice overclocking really is. Overclocking is one of the main selling points of high-end motherboards. Motherboards from Asus generally come with a friendly-looking BIOS with plenty of options, unlike what you might find on your laptop or home computer. On top of this, these motherboards are theoretically supposed to be extremely robust when it comes to feeding voltage to your CPUs and making sure that your hardware isn't pushed too far. That's why people are willing to spend upwards of $1,000 on their motherboards, to ensure that their multi-$1,000 hardware doesn't get fried. But what happens when they get fried anyway, regardless of whether you overclock or not? Well, that's precisely what started happening with Asus's 670 chipset motherboards due to a buggy BIOS update. Ever since the BIOS update, users started noticing that SoC voltage would randomly spike from 1.5 volts to as much as over 2 volts. CPU temperatures would also randomly spike from a normal 40 degrees Celsius to as much as 110 degrees Celsius. For my fellow Celsius illiterate friends, that's the same as 230 degrees Fahrenheit. If that sounds dangerously hot, it's because it is. It's hot enough to not just fry the CPU, but cause the CPU to burn up and even explode. Now, fortunately, a CPU burning up won't cause your house to catch on fire, or at least not usually. But what it will surely do is ruin your CPU and motherboard and cost you thousands of dollars. And now that enthusiasts were also getting screwed over by Asus, let's just say the community wasn't too happy. When this issue started surfacing, people weren't really that mad at Asus. The reality is that when you have dozens of motherboards and BIOSes to maintain and update, it's likely that at some point you mess something up. So the gaming community was actually rather accepting of Asus's misstep. What really turned the gaming community against Asus was not their missteps themselves, but rather how they decided to address the situation. The right course of action from Asus would have been to recall the BIOS update and compensate users who were affected by the buggy BIOS, but that's not what Asus did. Instead, Asus would not only refuse to take on liability, but they would actively shift the liability to consumers, and they weren't even sly about it either. What did Asus do that was so anti-consumer, you ask? Well, they would push out a beta BIOS update, which was supposed to fix the overvolting issue. There was a catch though. By updating to the beta BIOS, you void your warranty. So essentially, they were like, let's give these guys a short-term fix that may or may not work and absolve ourselves of all liability at the same time, as consumers are forced to upgrade to this new BIOS in fear of their CPUs burning up. If that's not anti-consumer policy, I'm not sure what is. As you may have guessed, this update threw the gaming community over the edge, prompting the viral videos that we touched on at the beginning. And as people started to take a closer look at Asus, they started to realize that such anti-consumer policies had been a part of the company for years at this point. It's just that most of those had been largely ignored or written off due to Asus's extremely strong brand image. We already touched on the crappy quality control of budget Asus hardware, but looking back, it seemed that higher-end Asus hardware were also lacking quality control. For example, in late 2021, a bunch of Asus Z690 boards were literally catching on fire because Asus allegedly accidentally reversed a capacitor on the board. Asus would recall these boards, so people gave them some slack, but looking back, Asus didn't recall these boards till a whopping 8 months after these boards started catching on fire. Imagine how many people were using these faulty boards on a daily basis and risking a fire during this 8-month period. Also, it's not like people were able to replace their boards 8 months later anyway, because a lot of them didn't even know about the recall. As Jace2Sense pointed out, looking back, Asus did one of the most low-key recalls we've ever seen, which is largely counterintuitive. Recalls should be well known and well publicized so that people are able to replace their faulty and even dangerous products. But that's not the direction that Asus chose to take. The reality was that Asus had been dropping the ball both with budget products and enthusiast products, but no one really questioned Asus simply because their ROG branding and marketing were so strong. But now that the cat's out of the bag, what happens to Asus? Well, honestly, in the short term, nothing much. While much of the core gaming community is boycotting Asus and opting for products from competitors like MSI, Gigabyte, and EVGA, this hasn't really affected Asus's top line, bottom line, or stock price. In fact, they're nearly at an all-time high, and the main reason for this is that the Asus brand has grown way past the gaming community. Marcus Brownlee, for example, has several videos about Asus ROG phones, all with millions of views. And Marcus doesn't run some sort of niche gaming channel. He runs one of the most broad audience tech channels on the planet. In other words, Asus has an insane amount of exposure outside of the gaming community. From a business standpoint, this was a great move from Asus. They've clearly grown their audience, but this isn't all that great for consumers. The average person buying an Asus phone likely has no idea about all of their shortcomings and anti-consumer policies. In fact, they may be partially buying an Asus phone thinking that they're getting away from all of Apple's anti-consumer policies, when in reality, they're just switching to another brand that benefits a lot from brand image and isn't all that kind to consumers. The good news is that Asus can't continue this behavior forever. If they do, it's only a matter of time until they make an even bigger misstep with one of their broad market devices. And while they may be able to survive Jay's 2 cents and Gamers Nexus turning on them, a video like this from Marcus Brownlee on his main channel may be too hard to overcome. Will Asus change their ways and start serving the customer once again? Well, judging by history, that's usually not how these sorts of things play out. So more than likely, the fundamental decline of Asus has begun, and it's only a matter of time until this ignorance and arrogance spreads to the rest of their business as well. And that's why the gaming community is boycotting Asus. Do you own any Asus hardware? And if so, would you consider purchasing from them again given their anti-consumer behavior? Comment that down below. Also, if you're interested in deeper dives, interviews with insiders, and exclusive tech analysis, consider checking out our free weekly newsletter. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.